Carol, it's wonderful to have you here. We've loved having your contributions to the Epoch Times all these months.
Thank you.
So, CPAC, have you been here before? I'm sure you've been here many times before.
No, I believe this might be my first time that I stayed, for the whole conference.
Okay.
And I've never been a CPAC speaker. I've not made the big league yet.
Really? Oh, I'm surprised. They've been missing out, I think. Carol, tell me a little bit about where you see conservatism going today, especially with this seeming either resurgence of socialism or simply unmasking of socialism in the country. I don't know which you see it as, or maybe a combination of both. But where do you see conservatism going?
Well, first of all, this socialism that's on display now, it's been underground for a long time. And on the university campuses, those of us who have studied cultural Marxism, we knew what was taking place. And we saw the infiltration of our churches as well as other institutions. And so now that it's out in the open, I think the American people will be able to make a choice of whether or not they really care about Judeo-Christian values or just the American way of life, because that's what is at stake.
So this cultural Marxism, how long has this been kind of coming into our society, and how did it start?
I can tell you that...
And did we fall asleep at the wheel?
We fell asleep at the wheel. And I've taught between Vanderbilt and Princeton for like 28 years. And I was never interested in Marxism. When I was in graduate school in the 1980s, there were Marxist professors, and they were eager to tell you that they were Marxists. I was not interested in that. And during the time I was at Princeton, there were, the rage was critical theory and deconstructionism, right, and all of this stuff, and I wasn't paying attention. And now, in the last, 8 years, I guess after Obama, or a little bit before, I started becoming interested in cultural Marxism. And with Obama, then all of a sudden it became important. So my last years of teaching at Vanderbilt, I taught a course on the impact of communism on American political thought. And it was a class that frequently had a waiting list. And so, for those of us that know something about communism, when economic Marxism failed, then the disciples of Karl Marx decided that they wanted to figure out why it failed. They decided that it was the culture, and they had to change the culture. So I would say that ever since Karl Marx's death, and it was 1898. It was.
I don't know the exact date, but quite a few years ago.
Long time ago, but they strategized on how to to make the country into his utopian vision. And so they infiltrated organizations. Columbia University, there were Marxists that fled Germany. They set up at Columbia University. They taught students that fanned out all across the country. And what I have seen is that Saul Alinsky helped with Rules for Radicals.
Right.
But, Herbert Marcuse, Antonio Gramsci,
right,
and some of those writers, they had a major impact on American society. And there was this...
and this is basically through the education system.
Yeah, through the education system. And, the stuff with political correctness, the trigger warnings, the safe spaces, all of this stuff is a way of shutting people down so that they can't fight back. And it was Herbert Marcuse's idea to use the suffering of racial and ethnic minorities as a way, to make inroads. And so the Black Civil Rights Movement, that was used to advance the cause. And so the Marxists, they've been very strategic, and the people that suffer the most, the victim class, they have been manipulated, they have been used, and very few of them are figuring out this.
Well, this is actually quite interesting, because in what we know about communist revolutions, there's always basically a minority that's genuinely has some kind of oppression or something against them, and then sort of the folks that want to create the communist utopia or begin the process or so forth will kind of try to activate that group, which has legitimate grievances. That's my take.
That's
right?
what they've done.
And you're saying that basically in America, the way that's played out is basically looking at basically racial tension, using past racism as a foil?
Well, racism was part of it, but if you look at just about every victim class, they have exploited the suffering of people. And you know, there has not been significant improvement in some areas, and it's just so much manipulation of people.
Right.
And you see, you know, with Black Americans and the progressive movement. And I say Black Americans because it was Jesse Jackson that decided we were all African Americans, and we've been called all sorts of things over the years. We keep changing what Black people are.
This is what Larry Elder told me when I interviewed him a few weeks ago. He said, "African American, I have nothing to do with Africa. I'm Black American."
There's some real African Americans that are white.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But I forgot what I was saying.
We're talking about basically how the people that were looking at creating a communist utopia and so forth were basically using past racism, past wrongs around racism to try to basically push the philosophy.
But what gets me is that with the progressive movement, with Planned Parenthood, for example, they have brainwashed so many Black people that they are actually cooperating with the people that are really decimating their population. In many cities, including New York, there are more Black babies being aborted than are being born. And to me, it's the saddest thing to hear Black people articulate the leftist argument that people who are poor shouldn't have children. If that was the case, I would not have been born, because I was born into poverty, and Ben Carson was born into poverty, and we can name all sorts of people who have been successful that were born into poverty. And so the argument is that if you come from a poor family, you shouldn't have been born. And the fact that Black people would buy into that argument tells you the depth of the brainwashing.
So this is actually another topic that has come up in some of our discussions here at CPAC. It's kind of stunning to me, given what I understand to be some of the common values across the Black community, that Black Americans would vote en masse, essentially, Democrat, because there seems to be kind of a disjoint.
Well,
in
here's
the
what
values.
it comes from. It comes from the fact that Black people are very trusting of their leaders, and they have so many leaders that have essentially been bought off. Even the Black church has been taken over by the liberation theology, and that's Marxism at the core. And so it's the trust that Black people have for other Blacks that allows them, to not really investigate, or if you actually tell many of them the truth, they'll say you're lying. But I am encouraged by the young Black people that I see that are, they're moving away from the Democratic Party. They may not be embracing the Republican Party, but they're moving away from the Democratic Party. And so they really are becoming aware that there's a lot at stake, and that maybe they have been manipulated. And I think that that the progress is being made. I think that President Trump is doing a great job of reaching racial and ethnic minorities, because there's something about truth, when you hear it, it kind of resonates, like it reaches deep down. And I think
otherwise we wouldn't exist.
I know.
This is it's a very interesting, very interesting story. It gives new meaning to me as to why the significance of what Kanye West did when he basically said, I like how Candace Owens thinks. Because, obviously he is a kind of a leader in the Black American community, and suddenly people started thinking about what he said, right?
Well, I can tell you that for someone like me, I was a Democrat up until 2009. And I don't think there's a perfect political party, but once you leave the Democratic Party, you are ostracized. And even if you're a conservative, all of a sudden you're not Black, because the people that decide, who gets to call themselves Black, you have to be in lockstep with all of their views. And so if you don't share all their views, then you're not Black anymore. So some of us have been ousted, from the group that
I haven't heard that.
the ethnic group that we were born into. Well, it's not so terrible for me because I identify as a Christian, which means I have brothers and sisters from every race, ethnicity,
Right.
from all around the world. And so, that's not my primary identity. I don't go around all the time worried about thinking about my race or looking for offense. And I think that if I did, then, it would be a pretty miserable existence.
And Carol, so this actually speaks directly to your area of expertise. It seems like this, identity politics that stems from, this cultural Marxist approach is actually, intent on defining people into all these different types of small classifications,
Warring factions.
very specific classifications that aren't based on the individual, but are based on some kind of grouping. For example, the color of your skin, or your gender, your sex, or multiple other
region,
things. You get
social
into
class,
intersectional
yeah.
theory. It's all sorts of things, right? So I'm still struggling to wrap my head around that, and why it makes sense to people.
I think that in academia, and I was a professor again for 28 years, you get paid for coming up with ideas. And so you have to come up with something, and that encourages a lot of ludicrous thinking that gets rewarded. And so I think that you can just take something common, slap a new label on it, and it, gets embraced. But in the case of the cultural Marxism, I think they have a very specific intent and goals. Back in the late 1950s, there was a scholar named Cleon Skousen.
Okay.
He wrote a book called The Naked Communist.
Right.
And in his book, he had, I think it was 45, he called them current communist goals. And those goals were read into the congressional record in 1963. Among them, it was pretty clear that the communists that infiltrated our government, that they had a plan. One was to discredit the FBI. One was to normalize the homosexual lifestyle, to destroy the family, to infiltrate the schools, to discredit the FBI. You just go down the list of things. They have been so successful. And I think that when it comes to conservatives and their strategies and what they can do to reclaim their nation, that they have to adopt some of those strategies. So I actually encourage conservatives to read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals.
Right.
And some of his rules I like. I like when he says, make your enemy live up to their rule book. Well, on college campuses in various places, they have a mission statement, or they have a set of their values, which they usually don't live up to.
I see.
But in some cases, you can hold them accountable by that. And then they talk about ridicule. I mean, some of the most ridiculous things. For many decades, Christians were ridiculed because they believed in creation, the virgin birth, and things that some people thought were ridiculous. Now, with the political left, they don't believe that there's a difference between males and females. They reject science. I mean, before, they were the enlightened people that believed in science. All of a sudden, science does not advance the cultural Marxist agenda, so you have to reject science. And so it puts them in very ludicrous types of positions, and I think that we should exploit that. But I'm always encouraging young people to go into academia. Some people can keep their heads down low until their position. They can go into institutions or businesses. They can use the strategies of the left. They don't have to tip their hand. Everyone doesn't have to be like me. I tell everyone what I'm thinking. We don't all have to do that. And so there can be people that are steadily climbing up in institutions until they get positions of power. When they get into positions of power, they can basically, advance their own values and principles. And so I believe that's how you try to change things. You can reverse it, but it's going to take a strategy. It's going to take multiple strategies.
That's interesting. And you mentioned how basically let's call it the left, was perceived as these enlightened people, and now this has kind of shifted. It made me think of the distinction between liberal and leftist. And could you speak to that a little?
Well, I mean, Dennis Prager talks about that the traditional liberals are not the enemies of the conservatives, because for the most part, some of the secular humanists believe in free speech. They saw some value in religion. And with the progressive leftists that's part of this culture, Marxism, they don't believe in any of the values that are connected with our Constitution. And during the times I was in academia and I faced ostracism because I was a conservative, some of my biggest supporters were secular people, many of them were Jews, that just believed in what institutions are supposed to be about. Universities, marketplaces of ideas, diversity, different viewpoints. There are a lot of liberals who are not crazy, and they themselves are threatened by the progressive movement.
Fascinating. So, Carol, I hear that there may be some kind of, political run in the future for you. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, I can tell you that I've never aspired to be a politician.
Yeah.
And I've told people for many decades that the call on my life was to hold them accountable and not to be one. But last year, I was persuaded to enter a special election. It was like 5 weeks, field of 13. I came in number 2, and I was outspent 6-1. Well, this year, some Democrats approached me about running again. The city of Nashville, where I am contemplating running for mayor, is 70% Democrat, and it's always been run by Democrats, lots of corruption. In some ways it's moving towards becoming little Chicago, and it really needs a change agent. And I believe that it needs a stateswoman or statesman, and I'm willing to offer myself to the voters, and if I get elected, it will be a 4-year job. But I believe that what happens in Nashville doesn't stay in Nashville, that affects every city, town, and state in this country, and that if I can turn around an urban city like Nashville, then perhaps there's hope for Chicago, Detroit, and some other places. And I think my race is relevant in the sense that there's some problems in the city with crime, with schools, with incompetent leaders. No white person, no white Democrat will ever tackle those things. I'm not afraid to tackle the hard issues with the police and the fact that we have a crime problem. Some in the minority community would like to make it a police problem. I think that the police are needed, they need to be respected, but that they can work with the community. And so I'm willing to take on that challenge. And if I don't prevail, I will regroup and decide what's next.
Well, I think Nashville could really benefit from your mind, from your thoughtfulness, and potentially leadership. I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much.